Listen to what the operator heard.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Yep, I just need you to answer these questions so I can get you over to the captain.
Okay.
How many
what's
adults
going
on board?
So, there are 0 adults on board.
There's nobody on board the boat?
No. Nobody
right.
here is over the age of 21.
Sir, that was not the question. Is there a person? Is there a person, a living individual on the boat?
Hello?
Is there a living person, someone breathing on the boat? Is there anybody on the boat?
Yes, there's lots of people breathing on the boat.
All right, how many people, sir?
Like 7.
All right, thank you.
She asked one question nobody can explain. Is anybody alive on the boat? Why would she ask that? She didn't ask about the boat. She didn't ask about water levels. She asked if anybody was alive. What did she hear in that background that made her think someone was dead? And then there's the 41-hour mystery. Amit till tied to a cotton gin, his body surfaced in 3 days. Nolan Wells with no weight, no chains, no resistance. His body took 41 hours. Why would his body surface faster unless it wasn't in the water the first time? Unless it was dumped later. Unless somebody held it, kept it, hid it. And then they said 7 people came back, but 8 people left. Where is the 8th person? Who's the missing person? And why does nobody want to answer that question? This is the evidence that will prove what happened to Nolan Wells. July 4th morning, 30 youth across 3 boats left for Horn Island. 8 people on the boat with Nolan. They arrived at 11:30 a.m. They stayed for 5 hours. Not sunset, not sundown. 5 hours. And then they left. Why did they only stay 5 hours? And nobody's answering that question. Now here's where the timeline gets critical. Because 3 people say they saw Nolan alive, and all 3 of them saw him within the same narrow window. Between 2:30 and 4:30 p.m., the coach spoke to Nolan between 2:30 and 3:30. Javon saw Nolan at 3:40 and said he left to check on another friend who was crashing out on another boat. When Javon came back, Nolan was gone. Katie said she spoke to Nolan between 3 and 4:30. 3 people, same window, roughly 3:30 to 4:30, and that's when Nolan was alive for the last time, and that's when the probability of death is highest. But here's the problem: if all 3 of them saw Nolan within the same hour, why didn't they see each other? If Javon was there at 3:40, and the coach was there between 2:30 and 3:30, and Katie was there between 3 and 4:30, at least 2 of them should have run into each other on an island that size. Did the coach see Javon? Did Javon see the coach? Did Katie see either of them? Nobody's asking that question. Then that silence is suspicious. Or are they all pushing their time earlier? Or are they all saying they saw him a little earlier than they actually did, so they can't be pulled into the investigation as witnesses to a crime? Now let's talk about the phone and the keys. Because this is damning. Nolan's friends left him on an island, without his phone, without his keys. They took those with them back to the mainland. Think about that. You leave your best friend on an island in 2026, and you take his phone and his keys. Who does that? An 18-year-old without his phone, on an island with no escape, no way to call for help, no way to get off. And then Warren called Nolan's mother at 11 p.m., asking if she'd heard from Nolan. It's pitch black outside, it's almost midnight, and Warren is calling. But Warren already knows she hasn't heard from Nolan. Because Warren has Nolan's phone, Warren is holding the phone in his hand. But think about that. He's calling a mother, asking if she's heard from her son, while he's physically holding her son's phone. That's not ignorance. That's manipulation. That's psychological cruelty. Did he tell her he had the phone? Did he tell Christine that Nolan's phone was in his possession? That Nolan's phone never left the island with Nolan? I guarantee he didn't. Because if he did, Christine would immediately ask why Nolan doesn't have his phone. Christine would immediately know something was catastrophically wrong. Christine would have called police. So he lied. He called and acted concerned, but he knew. Now when Christine couldn't reach Nolan by phone, she used Life 360. She tracked the phone, and the phone was at Warren's friend's house on the mainland, which means they took it with them, which confirms Nolan never had his phone on that island, which confirms Nolan left with no way to call for help. So Christine and Javon's mother went to that house, and when they pulled up, the lights were off. Complete darkness. Because they saw Nolan's mother outside, and they didn't want to be recognized, they turned every light off. They hid in the dark. And when Christine forced them to come to the door, it took them 15 minutes to answer the door with a phone. 15 minutes of panic, 15 minutes of coordination, 15 minutes of evidence destruction. They were deleting Nolan's Snapchat account. They were removing messages. They were destroying any record. And then they handed over a phone that had been completely wiped clean. Subscribe right now, because what comes next is going to explain exactly what happened to Nolan Wells. Now let's talk about Katie's account, because Katie breaks the story. Katie says Nolan told her he had to get back to the boat because his friends were leaving soon. Katie's sister confirmed that. Nolan said, "It's time for me to head back to the boat because my friends are getting ready to leave." That's not a kid who's staying behind. That's not a kid who's choosing Katie over his friends. That's a kid who's trying to be responsible. That's a kid who's keeping his word. That's a kid who's leaving. But so, if Nolan wanted to leave with his friends, and if Katie confirms he said he needed to get back to the boat, then what happened between the time he left Katie and the time they made the distress call? Between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. That's 30 minutes. 30 minutes is enough time for everything to go wrong. Now let's talk about the most damning evidence. The Seto call. Because the Seto call doesn't make sense. They called at 4 o'clock saying the boat was sinking. The operator asked them how much water they were in. They first said 17 feet. Then they said 31 feet. Why don't you know if you're in 17 feet of water or 31 feet of water? You boat all the time. You know these waters. You know your boat. Why the confusion? Why the lie? And then the operator asked if they wanted her to call the Coast Guard. And the caller said no. No. If your boat is sinking, if you're taking on water in 31 feet of ocean, you don't care who comes to rescue you. If the Coast Guard, aliens, anyone. But this caller said no. We don't need the Coast Guard. Who says that? Who declines rescue when they're claiming the boat is sinking? Then the operator asked how many adults are on the boat. He said there are no adults on the boat. She said how many people are on the boat. He said everyone on the boat is under 21. She asked again, how many people? He wouldn't answer. She had to ask him 3 times. How many people are on the boat? And finally he said like 7. Like 7. Not 7. Like 7. The boat holds 8. 8 people left the island. 7 people came back. So why couldn't he say 7? Why did he have to say like 7? Because he didn't want to commit to a number. Because he didn't know if Nolan was still alive or not. Because he couldn't be sure if it was 7 or 8. So he said like 7. Like maybe 7. Possibly 7. 7 if Nolan doesn't surface. That's what like 7 means. And listen to this. The operator asked him, is anybody breathing on the boat? Is anybody alive on the boat? Those aren't standard questions. That's an operator who heard something in the background. That's an operator who felt something was wrong. The something in those voices told her something wasn't right. Is anybody alive on the boat? She said that because she sensed death. So this is the theory. They called the Coast Guard at 4 o'clock to create an alibi. They said the boat was sinking, so when Nolan's body is examined, when forensics determines a time of death around 4 o'clock, they can say, our boat was sinking at 4 o'clock. We were on the phone. That's impossible to ignore. That's the perfect alibi. Except the boat wasn't sinking. Nothing was wrong with the boat. There was no rescue needed. It was all fake. Because if you're sinking in the Gulf of Mexico, if you're genuinely in distress, you wouldn't decline the Coast Guard. You wouldn't get your water depth wrong. You wouldn't refuse to say how many people are on board. You wouldn't use the word like. You would be honest and direct because your life depends on it. Now let's talk about the autopsy. Because the state autopsy is done. The toxicology is done, but the throat tissue is missing. The lung tissue is missing. How is a forensic pathologist supposed to determine if Nolan was strangled if he doesn't have the throat tissue? How is he supposed to determine if Nolan drowned if he doesn't have the lung tissue? Both tissues are gone, taken, retained, disappeared. And then the DC medical examiner found red discoloration on the back of Nolan's head. But Nolan was found face down in the water. Nolan was transported face down, so blood couldn't drain backwards. Blood flows down. If he's face down in water, blood doesn't drain to the back of the skull, which means that red on the back of his head is trauma. That's impact. That's a blow to the head. I believe Nolan was hit in the back of the head. I believe that blow is what killed him. I believe the throat and lung tissue were kept because they would have shown something: strangulation marks, bruising, evidence of a chokehold, evidence that Nolan fought back, evidence that he was murdered. Now let's talk about why only one boat was investigated. 3 boats left Horn Island together. 30 youth. But the investigation only focused on Nolan's boat, Warren's boat, the 22-foot Triton. The other 2 boats got a pass. No GPS data pulled. No investigation initiated. Why? Those 3 boats were a team. They came together, but came back separately. Or did they? We don't know, because nobody investigated. How do we know Nolan wasn't on a different boat? How do we know he wasn't transferred between boats? How do we know the second and third boats weren't involved? We don't know because they were never investigated. They were never treated as crime scenes. They were left alone, protected, hidden. And that's probably because someone's parents have power in Mississippi. Someone's parents have connections. Someone's parents made phone calls and ensured their children would be protected. That's why the sheriff ruled this an accidental drowning before any investigation. That's why only 1 boat was examined. That's why 30 kids were never interrogated. That's why this case is broken. And I have a question for the investigators. When Nolan's body finally surfaced on the morning of July 6th, that's 41 hours later. 41 hours. Think about that. Think about the forensics of it. Emmett Till, August 1955. 14 years old. Thrown in a river, tied to a 75-pound cotton gin. A 75-pound weight, dragging him down, preventing flotation, preventing his body from rising. And yet his body surfaced in 3 days. Emmett Till was weighed down, and still rose in 3 days. Nolan Wells, July 2026, 18 years old, 200 plus pounds, athletic build, muscular, no weights, no gin attached, nothing holding him down, just Nolan and the Gulf of Mexico, and his body took 41 hours to surface. Why would Nolan surface faster than Emmett Till? Why would a young athletic man with no weights rise faster than an adolescent tied to heavy machinery? The answer is he shouldn't. Something doesn't match. Something in the timeline is wrong. Unless the body was held, unless Nolan was murdered on July 4th at 3:30 or 4 p.m. But his body wasn't put in the water until July 5th, or maybe even July 6th morning. Unless his killers were terrified that if they threw him in immediately, the body would surface while police were still at the island, while witnesses were still around, while the story wasn't finalized, so they panicked. They held his body, they kept him somewhere, maybe wrapped in the boat, maybe moved between boats, maybe stored on land, and then when they felt safe, when they felt the investigation was moving in the wrong direction, they dumped him. That's why the other 2 boats matter so much. That's why we need full GPS data on all 3 boats. That's why we need to know what the second and third boats were doing between July 4th and July 6th, because maybe the second boat held Nolan's corpse overnight. Maybe the third boat transported him between locations. Maybe all 3 boats are connected in covering up what happened. Maybe that's why they were all left off the investigation. Because law enforcement doesn't want to find out. Because the investigation is designed to fail. All 3 boats left together. 30 kids left together. They should all come back together under investigation. But they didn't. And that decision to separate them, to investigate only 1 boat, to leave 2 boats completely untouched, that's not accident. That's corruption. That's a cover-up at the highest level. And here's what I know for certain. Warren left his best friend on an island without a phone and without keys. Warren called Nolan's mother at 11 p.m. and didn't tell her he had the phone. Warren lied about the water depth on the Seto call. Warren couldn't say how many people were on the boat. Warren is either guilty or protecting the person who is. Because somebody killed Nolan Wells, somebody on one of those 3 boats, somebody who's walking free right now, somebody who's living a normal life while Christine Wells is grieving, somebody who knows exactly what happened, and I need Ben Crump and Al Sharpton to stop being humble about this. I need them to demand a federal investigation. I need them to march in Mississippi. I need them to activate the streets. Because this investigation is broken. This investigation is soft. This investigation is protecting killers. And until someone talks, until someone breaks, until someone decides that telling the truth is worth more than protecting their friends, Christine Wells will never know what happened to her son. She'll never know who took Nolan from this world, and neither will we. Subscribe so you don't miss the moment when someone finally decides to talk.